So Sandie Peggie, the NHS nurse who was accused of gross misconduct for misgendering a colleague after she objected to essentially a male doctor sharing a changing room with her, has been cleared of any wrongdoing. She's also currently in a tribunal. She is essentially suing her NHS trust for mistreatment. Andrew, it's good news that she's been cleared of misconduct for essentially standing up for her right to have a single-sex space. But how the hell did we get here in the first place? How have we landed in this insane world where a woman demanding a private changing room or a changing room free of men can lead to her potentially being punished?
Well, this is the big question, isn't it? How is it that we've reached a situation where NHS Fife, in this case, a health board, is effectively demonizing and punishing a woman who, I mean, this is a nurse of 30 years standing. She's had an unblemished career and she's been dragged through the mud. As we know, the process is the punishment in these cases. I mean, we should be very clear about what happened here. Sandie Peggie, a nurse, was undressing in the female changing area at the hospital. And a man, Beth Upton, a man who identifies as female, was determined to stay in there, was asked to leave because it's very sensitive, obviously, as you can understand. And then claimed that he was being bullied as a result of this. And all of these spurious accusations, as you say, have now been proven to be untrue. But the bigger question is, why is it that NHS Fife has been siding with the male doctor in this case? What's happened during the course of this tribunal, of course, is that the Supreme Court judgment has come out and clarified the law that, in fact, NHS Fife had an obligation to provide single-sex changing areas for its staff. So it was on the wrong side of the law in this case. That's all now absolutely clear. But there's also the broader problem that within the medical world is that so many people seem to believe this genderist nonsense. For a start, you've got Dr. Beth Upton, who said during the course of the tribunal under oath, there's no agreed definition of biological sex, and that the phrase biological sex is a nebulous dog whistle. I mean, you've got to ask, if a qualified doctor is saying that, I mean, I don't want that doctor treating me. Like, it's surely clear that that's medicine 101. If you don't understand that there are men and women and that they are different, that doesn't make any sense at all. So there's that going on. We've also had the case of, during the tribunal as well, we had the head of equalities at the hospital saying that she couldn't be sure that she herself was female because she'd never checked her chromosomes. Now, this is absolutely insane. Now, everyone can tell you that this stuff it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But why is it that the ideology has become so embedded? Why are people just nodding along with this stuff, even when they're in positions of authority, even when they're in the medical profession? I don't know how we've reached this point, but it's what's really interesting is, of course, that every single tribunal that goes this way, including obviously the famous landmark Maya Starter case, including Denise Farmy when she took on the Arts Council England, it always goes the right way ultimately when it gets to the courts. And I think that's because gender ideologues, all of a sudden, they're on the stand and they have to justify their position. And of course they can't. So they end up saying absolutely crazy things, like biological sex isn't real, like it's a nebulous dog whistle, like a man can be a lesbian, as we saw in the Mermaids versus LGB Alliance case. So the more these things are brought to trial, the more absurd their position will become and the more obvious that will become to the nation as a whole. And that's what's happening. People are waking up because of various cases and tribunals and trials of this kind. So the Sandie Peggie case has been a really good thing in terms of edging us closer towards sanity, but it's been terrible for her. And there's absolutely no way she should have been put through this to begin with.
There's a sort of, I don't know, something cartoonish about this tribunal, as there often is. I mean, the head of equality is called Isla Bumba, who sounds like a sort of character, like satirical character. Sounds a bit like Titania McGrath. I mean, Andrew's right. Every time you see one of these tribunals, you get this stark contrast between the seriousness of the court and the absurdity of this, ideology. I can't remember which tribunal it was, but I'm being reminded of the person that brought their, support dog along with them so that they could give evidence about why men and women are, why there's no such thing about biological sex, or whatever it was. But Tom, what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. There's the silliness contrasted with the seriousness. And without wanting to get into all of the quite personal details, it's worth remembering what sparked this to begin with, which is the fact that I think it was on Christmas Eve, Sandie Peggie is working in the hospital in Fife, having a particularly heavy period, and was wanting to go into the women's changing rooms to make sure she was all okay, make sure she was, ready for a shift and so on, and then comes across this man in that space. This is not a woman who is doing this as a kind of stunt, who is doing this because she's just an ideologue who wants to kind of campaign on this issue. This is a clear-cut question of women's spaces, women's dignity, which is why sex-based rights and sex-segregated spaces exist. So it's one of those things where it's remarkable that it's become such a supposedly kind of low status, if not bigoted opinion, to think that those things are quite important, quite hard fought for. You know, it used to be in the health service that it was considered an outrage if there were wards in which men and women were expected to share space, because of the fact that all kinds of different procedures that take place, people generally want to be around their own sex for precisely those reasons of privacy and dignity. That's almost been rebranded as a positive thing as a consequence of gender ideology. And the extent to which even the health service can be captured by this in the way that you've been describing, Andrew, I think has been really striking. The way in which they've deferred to these idiots like this Bumble who claims that she cannot even say definitively herself whether or not she is female.
Yeah.
How did you allow the lunatics to take over the asylum to this extent? And it's another example, I suppose, of the fact that even after the Supreme Court ruling, it's going to take a lot more heroic figures like Sandie Peggie, a lot more court cases, a lot more campaigns, unfortunately, to just bring us back to a commonsensical women's rights respecting position.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but it's necessary, I think, to make sure that we actually properly push this stuff out of our institutions, not least the health service, where it surely shouldn't exist any more so in other places.
And before we move on, Andrew, I just wanted to ask you a bit about the police. You may have seen there's been this case this week where the High Court have essentially told Northumberland police that they should not be going on pride marches, that this is obviously showing them up as not impartial. They shouldn't be warriors for gender ideology. They should be on anyone's side who needs the law. I mean, what have you made of the capture of the police as well as the NHS in that sense? I mean, that is also particularly alarming because that means that people can be thrown in jail or interrogated for having the wrong beliefs or having, gender critical beliefs.
I'm very alarmed. I'm pleased about the High Court judgment in this case. I believe that it's necessary for the police to be impartial when it comes to matters of politics. Unfortunately, them participating in pride parades has been interpreted as just the police making clear that they're for gay rights. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Pride is now effectively an anti-gay movement. It believes in an ideology that sees young gay people surgically corrected for not adhering to old-fashioned gender stereotypes. It is a movement that has seen the erosion of women's spaces. So the police, whether they understand those issues or not, and I would say that in most cases they don't, even though they've been told many, many times, and lots of gay campaigners and feminist campaigners have alerted them to the problem. So they can't claim that the information isn't there. So that it's very much taking a side in a very, very divisive issue. And of course, the police absolutely shouldn't be doing that. So that's very, very important. This will be misrepresented in the press as being, the police are no longer allowed to support gay rights or whatever. Of course, it's the absolute opposite. They were implicitly showing their support for a movement that is against gay rights by participating directly in pride parades. That won't be broadly understood. But the bigger question that you allude to is this serious question of ideological capture. How is it that we've reached the point where the police are waving flags for this divisive movement? How is it we've reached the point that doctors are saying things that are biologically incorrect in order to uphold an ideology that has absolutely nothing to do with biological fact or medicine or reality? Why is it that the courts even are captured to a degree? Some judges, there are a few crazy activist judges who ensure that the decision goes the wrong way. I understand that for the most part, gender ideology is being defeated in the courts. But what would happen if, for example, Lady Brenda Hale was still in charge of the Supreme Court? She recently said, I've been speaking to doctors who tell me there's no such thing as biological sex. Now, had she been in charge of the Supreme Court this April, when that ruling came down, it might have gone the other way. We really are dependent on the courts not being ideologically captured. And we're just lucky that the current occupants of the Supreme Court aren't Lady Hale, because it would have gone the other way and we would have been in an absolute mess. We have to find some way to protect our major institutions from ideological capture. And so far, it's the courts doing that job, as we've seen with this case of the High Court ruling and the police. But we have to ask the question, what do we do if the courts become captured? Because then we're screwed.